The door slammed behind Willa Dawson with such force that the windows rattled, and before she could catch her breath or beg one more time for mercy, her father's final words cut through the bitter January air like a knife. "You are no daughter of mine." Willa stumbled forward into the snow, her stockinged feet instantly soaking through as the freezing white powder engulfed her ankles. She had not even been allowed to grab her boots before her father dragged her from their modest home on the outskirts of Pendleton, Oregon, his face purple with rage and whiskey-fueled righteousness. The year was 1882, and the winter had been particularly brutal in the Blue Mountains region, with snowdrifts piling higher than a man's head in some places. Willa turned back toward the house, her honey-colored hair whipping across her face in the wind, and saw her father's silhouette in the window before he yanked the curtain closed. Her younger sister's pale face appeared for just a moment in another window before she too disappeared from view. 20 years old and cast out like refuse, all because she had refused to marry the wealthy banker her father had chosen for her. Emmett Caldwell was 53 years old with breath that reeked of cigars and hands that wandered where they should not. Willa had endured his attentions for 3 awkward dinners before she finally told her father she would rather die unmarried than become that man's wife. Her mother had been dead for 5 years, and there was no one left to intercede on her behalf. Her father had given her 1 week to reconsider. When that week ended today and Willa still refused, his rage had exploded like a powder keg. Now she stood alone as darkness crept across the sky, the temperature dropping with each passing minute. The main road into Pendleton was at least 2 miles away, and she knew she would never make it that far in her current state. Already her feet had gone from painful to numb, and her thin cotton dress offered no protection against the wind that cut through the fabric like it was not even there. She wrapped her arms around herself and began walking, each step a small agony as ice crystals formed on her eyelashes. Willa had made it perhaps half a mile down the snow-covered path when her legs finally gave out. She crumpled into a drift beside a fence post, her teeth chattering so violently she bit her tongue and tasted blood. This was how she would die, she thought with strange clarity. Frozen and alone because she had dared to want something different than what her father demanded. The injustice of it burned in her chest even as the cold threatened to extinguish that flame forever. She thought of her sister, sweet 13-year-old Margaret, and hoped their father would not try to sell her off too when she came of age. The world was growing fuzzy around the edges when Willa heard the sound of hoofbeats. She tried to lift her head but could not manage it. The hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped. Through the haze of her dimming consciousness, she heard a man's voice, deep and urgent. "Jesus Christ, there's someone in the snow." Strong hands touched her shoulders, turning her over gently. Willa forced her eyes open and found herself staring up at a face she would never forget. The man was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that fell across his forehead beneath a worn Stetson. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they widened with alarm as he took in her condition. "Miss, can you hear me? What happened to you?" Willa's lips moved, but no sound emerged. The cowboy did not waste time asking more questions. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. Willa felt herself being lifted onto a horse, and then the cowboy swung up behind her, keeping one arm locked around her waist to hold her steady against his chest. "Stay with me now," he said, his voice close to her ear. "The line shack is about 6 miles from here. I am going to get you there and get you warm. 6 miles. Through snow that was still falling." Willa wanted to tell him it was too far, that he should just leave her and save himself the trouble, but darkness was pulling at her and she could not form the words. She felt the horse begin to move, felt the steady rhythm of the cowboy's heartbeat against her back, and then she knew nothing more. Pierce Quinlan had been riding fence for the Double Bar Ranch when he spotted what he first thought was a bundle of rags in the snow. The Double Bar was one of the largest cattle operations in eastern Oregon, sprawling across thousands of acres of high desert and mountain rangeland. Pierce had worked there for 3 years, ever since he drifted into the territory from Montana with nothing but his horse, his saddle, and a desire to leave his past behind. He was a good hand, reliable and hardworking, and the foreman had promoted him to fence rider last year, which meant long days alone checking the miles of barbed wire that kept the cattle contained. He had never expected to find a woman dying in the snow. Now, as he urged his horse forward through the deepening drifts, Pierce kept his arm tight around the woman's waist and bent his head against the wind. She was unconscious, which worried him greatly, and when he had picked her up, he had seen that her feet were bare. Bare feet in this weather meant frostbite, and frostbite could mean amputation or death. He needed to get her warm and dry as quickly as possible. The 6 miles to the line shack felt like 60. Pierce's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Duke, plowed through snow that sometimes reached his chest. Pierce talked to the woman even though she could not hear him, telling her about the shack, about the fire he would build, about how she was going to be all right. He did not know if he believed his own words, but speaking them aloud helped him focus on something other than the cold seeping through his vest and the weight of responsibility that had suddenly fallen onto his shoulders. When the line shack finally appeared through the swirling snow, Pierce nearly sobbed with relief. It was a small structure, barely 12 feet square, but it had a stove and a bunk and walls that would keep out the wind. He dismounted carefully, keeping his hold on the woman, then kicked the door open and carried her inside. The interior was freezing and dark, but at least it was shelter. Pierce laid the woman on the bunk, then moved with practiced efficiency to build a fire in the pot-bellied stove that squatted in the corner. Within minutes, flames were crackling, and the first tendrils of warmth began to spread through the small space. Pierce lit a kerosene lamp and turned his attention back to the woman. In the light, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, with a delicate face that was far too pale and lips tinged with blue. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins and spread across the rough blanket like spilled silk. She was beautiful, Pierce realized with a start, and then immediately felt guilty for noticing such a thing when she was fighting for her life. He pulled off his gloves and touched her cheek. Ice cold. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her frame, and Pierce knew he needed to get her out of those wet clothes before hypothermia killed her. His face flushed at the impropriety of it, but there was no other choice. He turned away to give her what privacy he could while he worked, moving as quickly and respectfully as possible to peel away the frozen layers of fabric. He wrapped her in every blanket and spare shirt he could find in the shack, then pulled off her wet stockings with his jaw clenched tight. Her feet were in bad shape. The skin was waxy and white in places, angry red in others. Pierce filled a basin with lukewarm water from his canteen and warmed it slightly on the stove, then carefully submerged her feet. He had seen frostbite before and knew that warming had to happen slowly, gradually, or the tissue damage would be even worse. While the water worked its magic, Pierce sat beside the bunk and rubbed the woman's hands between his own, trying to restore circulation. "Come on now," he murmured. "You have made it this far. Do not give up on me." As if in response to his words, the woman's eyelids fluttered. Pierce leaned closer, his heart hammering in his chest. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of spring grass, and for a long moment she simply stared at him with confusion and fear. "You are safe," Pierce said quickly. "I found you in the snow and brought you to a lined shack. You are going to be all right." The woman's gaze darted around the small room, then back to Pierce's face. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, rough and cracked. "My father threw me out." Pierce felt anger surge through him, hot and fierce. What kind of man would throw his own daughter out into a blizzard without even shoes on her feet? He kept his voice calm and gentle, though, not wanting to frighten her. Why would he do such a thing? Tears spilled down the woman's cheeks. "I would not marry the man he chose. Emmett Caldwell. He is old and cruel, and I could not bear the thought of belonging to him." Pierce understood then. He had seen it before, fathers treating their daughters like property to be sold to the highest bidder. His own sister had nearly been forced into a similar situation back in Montana, and it was part of the reason Pierce had left. He had threatened to kill the man his father had chosen for Sarah, and his father had told him to leave and never come back. Pierce had not spoken to any of his family in 5 years. "Your father was wrong," Pierce said firmly. "No one should be forced to marry against their will. What is your name?" "Willa Dawson." She looked down at herself, wrapped in blankets, and a flush of color finally appeared in her cheeks. "Did you undress me? Your clothes were soaked through. I had to get you warm. I apologize for the liberty, but it was necessary to save your life." Willa studied him for a long moment, and Pierce felt as though she were looking straight through him, measuring the truth of his words. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did." Pierce moved to check the water around her feet, which was finally starting to steam slightly. "Your feet are frostbitten. How do they feel now?" "They hurt," Willa admitted. "But I suppose that is better than not feeling them at all. Pain means the blood is returning. That is a good sign." Pierce carefully dried her feet and wrapped them in clean cloth, then pulled up a rickety chair to sit beside the bunk. "The storm shows no signs of letting up. We may be stuck here for a day or two." Willa's eyes widened with alarm. "A day or two, but people will talk. My reputation, your reputation will not matter much if you are dead," Pierce said bluntly. "Besides, no one needs to know we were here alone. When the storm passes, I will take you into town and we will say I found you and brought you straight there." "You would lie for me," Willa's voice held wonder. "I would tell a necessary falsehood to protect you, yes." Pierce stood and moved to the stove, where he had a small pot of beans warming. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning, I think." Willa struggled to sit up, keeping the blankets clutched around her. "I feel foolish for being so helpless." "You are not helpless. You are hurt and cold and you have been through something terrible. Let someone help you for once." Pierce ladled beans into a tin cup and brought it to her along with a spoon. "It is not much, but it will put some strength back into you." Willa accepted the cup with trembling hands. The first bite made her close her eyes in appreciation, and Pierce realized she must have been hungry for longer than just one day. He watched her eat, noting the hollows beneath her cheekbones and the thinness of her wrists. Had her father been starving her as well as mistreating her? As if reading his thoughts, Willa said, "My father spent most of his money on whiskey. My sister and I made do with what little was left. We had a small garden in the summer, but winter has been hard." "You have a sister, Margaret. She is only 13. Fresh tears welled in Willa's eyes. "I hate leaving her there with him, but what choice did I have?" Pierce sat back down, his mind working. "When the storm passes and we get you to town, we will figure something out. Maybe we can get the sheriff involved." "The sheriff is friends with my father. He will not help me." Willa set the empty cup aside. "I have nothing now. No money, no family, no prospects. I suppose I will have to find work somewhere, but who will hire a woman with no references and a scandal attached to her name?" I told you, there will be no scandal. As far as anyone knows, I found you and brought you straight to town." Pierce leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And you are not without friends. You have me now." The look Willa gave him was full of such hope and vulnerability that Pierce felt something shift in his chest. He barely knew this woman, had only found her an hour ago, but already he felt a fierce protectiveness toward her. Maybe it was because she reminded him of his sister. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something he was not ready to name yet. Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to pile against the walls of the shack. Inside, warmth slowly filled the small space. Pierce made coffee on the stove and they talked, tentative at first but with growing ease. Willa told him about her life in Pendleton, about her mother's death, and how her father had changed afterward, turning bitter and cruel. She spoke of her sister with love and worry, and of her dreams of one day having a place of her own where she could live freely. Pierce found himself sharing things he had not spoken of in years. He told Willa about growing up in Montana, about his large family, and the disagreement that had driven him away. He spoke of his work on the Double Bar Ranch, of the satisfaction he found in hard physical labor, and the peace of being alone with the land and the animals. He did not mention how lonely he sometimes felt, but somehow he suspected she understood that part without him having to say it. As the hours passed, Willa's color returned and her shivers subsided. Pierce checked her feet regularly and was relieved to see that while they were bruised and swollen, the frostbite did not appear to be severe. She would recover fully with time and care. When exhaustion finally claimed her and she drifted back to sleep, Pierce sat in the chair beside the bunk and watched the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. He had saved a life today. More than that, he had met someone who made him feel less alone in the world. Pierce did not believe in fate or divine intervention, but he could not help thinking that maybe, just maybe, he had been meant to ride that particular stretch of fence line at that particular time. The storm raged for 2 full days and nights. Pierce and Willa were trapped in the line shack together, and what could have been awkward or uncomfortable instead became something precious. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Pierce taught Willa to play poker with a battered deck of cards he found in a tin on the shelf. Willa told Pierce about the books she had read, borrowed from the schoolteacher in town, and made him laugh with her dramatic retellings of adventure novels. On the second night, as they sat together on the bunk with the blankets wrapped around them for warmth, Willa rested her head on Pierce's shoulder. "I should be terrified," she said softly. "I should be worried about what comes next, but when I am with you, I just feel safe." Pierce's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "You are safe. I will make sure of it." Willa tilted her face up toward his, and in the lamplight her eyes were luminous. "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not even know me." "I know enough," Pierce said. His heart was pounding now, and he could feel the warmth of her body pressed against his side. "I know you are brave enough to stand up to your father even when it meant losing everything. I know you care deeply about your sister. I know you have strength that most people never find in themselves. I do not feel very strong right now. You are the strongest person I have ever met." The words came out rougher than Pierce intended, thick with emotion. "Willa, he did not get to finish his sentence." Willa reached up and pressed her fingers gently against his lips, silencing him. Then she replaced her fingers with her mouth, kissing him softly, tentatively, as though she were afraid he might push her away. Pierce did not push her away. Instead, he cradled her face in his hands and kissed her back with all the tenderness and longing that had been building in him for 2 days. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Willa's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "I have never done that before," she whispered, Kissed a man. I am honored to be your first. Pierce stroked her cheek with his thumb. Willa, this is probably too soon and you have been through too much, but I need you to know something. I am falling in love with you. Willa's breath caught. I am falling in love with you too. I know it is mad and impossible, and we have only known each other for 2 days. But sometimes you just know, Pierce finished. Sometimes something feels so right that you cannot deny it no matter how illogical it seems. They kissed again, longer this time, and Pierce felt as though his heart might burst from the force of what he was feeling. When they finally settled down to sleep, Willa curled against his chest and Pierce held her close, listening to the wind outside and marveling at how completely his life had changed in the span of 48 hours. The storm broke on the 3rd morning, revealing a world transformed by snow. The drifts were so deep that Pierce had to dig their way out of the shack, and Duke stood in the makeshift lean-to looking annoyed at having been cooped up for so long. Pierce saddled the horse while Willa wrapped herself in his coat again, her feet now bandaged and protected by an extra pair of Pierce's wool socks stuffed into his spare boots. They were far too big for her, but they were better than nothing. "Ready?" Pierce asked, helping her mount. "As ready as I will ever be." Willa settled into the saddle and Pierce swung up behind her. "What do we do when we get to town?" Pierce had been thinking about this question for most of the night. "First, we get you somewhere safe. There is a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher. She is a good woman, fair and kind. I will pay for a room for you there." "I cannot let you do that. You have already done so much." "You can and you will." Pierce's tone left no room for argument. "Once you are settled, I am going to have a conversation with your father." Willa stiffened in his arms. "Pierce, no. He is dangerous when he has been drinking. Then it is a good thing I am not afraid of him." Pierce urged Duke forward into the snow. "He needs to understand that you are under my protection now, and if he tries to hurt you again, he will have me to answer to." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunching of snow beneath Duke's hooves and the occasional call of a winter bird. Pendleton appeared in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys and the streets slowly being dug out after the storm. Pierce guided Duke toward the edge of town where the boarding house stood, a neat 2-story structure painted white with green shutters. "Mrs. Fletcher answered Pierce's knock with a look of surprise that quickly turned to concern when she saw Willa's condition. "Goodness gracious, what happened to this poor girl?" Pierce gave the story they had agreed upon. He had found Willa on the road after she had gotten separated from her family during the storm. He had taken her to the nearest shelter, which was the line shack, and stayed there with her until the weather cleared. Now he needed a respectable place for her to stay while she recovered. Mrs. Fletcher, who was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner, did not look entirely convinced, but she also did not ask uncomfortable questions. "Well, bring her in then. The poor dear looks half frozen still. I have a room on the 2nd floor, nice and warm with a good mattress. It will be $2 a week for room and board." "I will pay for a month in advance," Pierce said, pulling bills from his pocket. "Pierce, no," Willa protested, but he shook his head. "This is not up for debate." He pressed the money into Mrs. Fletcher's hand. "Please take good care of her. She has been through a terrible ordeal." Mrs. Fletcher pocketed the money and took Willa's arm gently. "Come with me, dear. Let us get you into a warm bath and some proper clothes. I think I have a dress or two that might fit you." Willa looked back at Pierce, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Will you come back?" "Nothing could keep me away," Pierce promised. "I have some business to attend to first, but I will be back before supper." He watched as Mrs. Fletcher led Willa inside, then mounted Duke again and rode toward the other side of town where Willa had said her father's house was located. His jaw was set in a grim line, and his hands were tense on the reins. Pierce was not a violent man by nature, but he was going to make very sure that Clarence Dawson understood the consequences if he ever tried to hurt his daughter again. The Dawson house was a small, weathered structure that looked like it had not seen a coat of paint in a decade. Pierce tied Duke to the fence post and knocked sharply on the door. After a moment, it was opened by a young girl with the same honey-colored hair as Willa but a thinner face and shadows under her eyes. "This must be Margaret." "Is your father home?" Pierce asked, trying to soften his voice. The girl nodded, her eyes wary. "Who are you?" "My name is Pierce Quinlan. I need to speak with him about your sister." Margaret's expression changed, hope and fear warring on her face. "Is Willa all right? We thought she must have died in the storm." "She is alive and safe, no thanks to your father." Pierce did not bother to hide his anger now. "Get him. Now." Margaret disappeared into the house and returned a moment later, followed by a man who matched Pierce's mental image perfectly. Clarence Dawson was tall and gaunt with a drinker's flushed face and eyes that held more meanness than intelligence. He looked Pierce up and down with open hostility. "What do you want?" "I want to make sure you understand something," Pierce said, his voice deadly calm. "Your daughter Willa is under my protection now. If you ever try to contact her, if you ever try to hurt her again, if you even speak her name in a way I do not like, I will make you regret it. Am I clear?" Clarence laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "And just who the hell are you to come to my house making threats? That girl got what she deserved for defying me. She is probably dead in a ditch somewhere by now." Pierce moved faster than Clarence could react, grabbing the older man by his shirt front and slamming him against the doorframe. "She nearly did die, because you threw her out without even shoes on her feet in the middle of a blizzard. That makes you lower than any animal I have ever encountered. The only reason I am not beating you senseless right now is because your younger daughter is watching, but make no mistake, if you step out of line, I will finish this." He released Clarence with enough force that the man stumbled backward. Pierce turned to Margaret, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "If he mistreats you, if you need help, come find me. I work at the Double Bar Ranch. Ask anyone in town and they can tell you how to get word to me." Margaret nodded mutely. Pierce gave Clarence one last hard look, then strode back to his horse and rode away, his blood still hot with anger. He hated men like that, bullies who used their power over people weaker than themselves to feel strong. The temptation to truly hurt Clarence had been almost overwhelming, but Pierce knew that would only cause more problems. Better to make his position clear, and hope the man had enough sense to stay away from Willa. He returned to the boarding house as promised, and found Willa in the parlor wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Fletcher had loaned her. Her hair was clean and braided over one shoulder, and she looked like a completely different person from the half-frozen girl he had pulled from the snow. She was beautiful, Pierce thought again, but more than that, she looked peaceful in a way she had not before. "You came back," Willa said, rising from her chair. "I told you I would." Pierce took her hands in his. "I spoke with your father. He will not bother you again. Did you hurt him?" "No, though it was tempting. I just made sure he understood that you are not alone anymore." Pierce hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Willa, I have been thinking. I do not want to rush you or make you feel pressured, but I need to say this. I love you. I know it is fast, and I know we barely know each other by conventional standards, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Willa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too. These past few days have been the worst and best of my life all at once. The worst because of what my father did, but the best because I found you." Pierce pulled her close, holding her carefully as though she were something precious that might break. "Marry me," he whispered into her hair. I do not have much, just my wages from the ranch and a little savings, but I swear I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." Willa pulled back just far enough to look up at him, her face radiant with joy. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." They kissed there in Mrs. Fletcher's parlor, not caring if anyone saw, and Pierce felt as though he had been waiting his whole life for this moment without even knowing it. When they finally broke apart, Mrs. Fletcher was standing in the doorway with a knowing smile on her face. "I take it congratulations are in order?" she asked. "We are going to be married," Willa announced, and the happiness in her voice made Pierce's chest swell with pride and love. "Well, that is wonderful news. I suppose I should start calling you Mrs. Quinlan in advance." Mrs. Fletcher winked. "Now, you two behave yourselves under my roof. I run a respectable establishment." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Pendleton. Pierce used the last of his savings to buy Willa a ring, nothing fancy but solid gold that would last a lifetime. The foreman from the Double Bar Ranch stood as witness along with Mrs. Fletcher, who dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief throughout the entire service. Willa wore a cream-colored dress that she had sewn herself from fabric Pierce had bought her, working late into the nights to have it ready in time. The one shadow over their happiness was Margaret, who was still trapped in their father's house. Willa worried about her sister constantly, but when they sent word asking Margaret to come live with them, Clarence refused to allow it. Pierce promised they would find a way to get Margaret out eventually, but in the meantime, they focused on building their life together. Pierce had spoken to his foreman at the Double Bar, and while the ranch did not have housing available for married couples among the regular hands, they did need someone to manage one of the smaller line camps on the northern edge of the property. It was isolated work, lonely for a single man, but perfect for a newly married couple. The cabin was small but sturdy, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace, and it came with a salary that was slightly better than what Pierce had been making as a fence rider. They moved into the cabin in early March as the snow began to melt, and the first hints of spring appeared on the mountain slopes. Willa transformed the bare cabin into a home with an efficiency that amazed Pierce. She made curtains from flour sacks, planted a garden in the small, cleared space behind the house, and filled the rooms with wildflowers whenever she could find them. Pierce worked long days checking on the cattle that grazed the high pastures, but he always rode home at night to find Willa waiting with dinner ready and a smile that made every hardship worthwhile. They were happy in a way that Pierce had not known was possible. Every morning he woke up with Willa in his arms and marveled that this was his life now. Every evening they sat together by the fire and talked about their days, making plans for the future. Pierce taught Willa to ride properly so she could accompany him sometimes on his rounds. Willa taught Pierce to read better than he had learned in his scattered years of schooling, opening up whole worlds through books they borrowed from the town library. At night, they made love with a passion and tenderness that left them both breathless, learning each other's bodies with the joy of new lovers who knew they had a lifetime to explore every inch. Willa blossomed under Pierce's care and attention, gaining weight and color until she glowed with health and happiness. Pierce found himself smiling for no reason, humming as he worked, feeling lighter than he had in years. In May, Willa told him she was pregnant. She was nervous, uncertain how he would react to becoming a father so soon, but Pierce's whoop of joy, and the way he spun her around the cabin until she was dizzy and laughing left no doubt about his feelings. That night he laid his hand on her still flat belly and made promises to the child growing there, promises to always protect and provide, to be the kind of father his own father had never quite managed to be, The summer passed in a haze of golden contentment. Willa's belly swelled as the garden flourished, and Pierce split his time between his ranch duties and preparing the cabin for a baby. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. He reinforced the cabin walls and added extra insulation for the winter months. He rode into town and returned with yards of soft flannel for baby clothes, watching with pride as Willa sewed tiny gowns and blankets. In August, word reached them that Clarence Dawson had died, thrown from a horse in a drunken accident. Pierce held Willa as she cried, mourning not the man her father had become, but the man she wished he could have been. They rode to Pendleton for the funeral and found Margaret there, 13 years old and lost without any family left. There was no discussion needed. They brought Margaret home with them to the line camp, and she took over the small second room that Pierce had been planning to convert into a nursery. Having Margaret, there changed the dynamic of their household, but in good ways. The girl was shy at first, traumatized by her years with their father, but Willa's gentle care and Pierce's steady kindness slowly drew her out. She helped with the cooking and cleaning, tended the garden, and in the evenings Pierce taught both sisters to play the harmonica he had owned since childhood. Margaret's laughter began to ring out more frequently, and she started to look less like a frightened rabbit and more like the child she should have been all along. In late October, as the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, Willa went into labor. Pierce rode like the devil was chasing him to fetch Mrs. Fletcher, who had agreed to serve as midwife, then spent the longest hours of his life pacing outside the cabin, while Willa's cries tore at his heart. Margaret sat on the porch steps with her hands clasped in prayer, and Pierce wanted to join her but could not make his feet stop moving. When the baby's cry finally split the air, Pierce nearly fell to his knees with relief. Mrs. Fletcher opened the door with a tired but triumphant smile. "You have a son, Mr. Quinlan. A big, healthy boy with a set of lungs on him that will wake the dead." Pierce stumbled into the cabin and found Willa propped up against the pillows, exhausted and pale but smiling as she held a red-faced, squalling bundle. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Our son, Pierce. Look at him." Pierce sat carefully on the edge of the bed and touched one tiny fist with his finger. The baby's hand opened and then closed around Pierce's finger, gripping with surprising strength, and Pierce felt his whole world shift once again. He had thought he understood love when he found Willa in the snow when he married her, but this was different. This was deeper and fiercer, a primal need to protect that went beyond reason. "What should we name him?" Willa asked softly. They had discussed names for weeks without settling on anything. Now, looking at his son, Pierce said, "How about William? After your mother, we could call him Will." Willa's face crumpled and she nodded, too overcome to speak. They named the baby William Pierce Quinlan, and he was perfect in every way that mattered. He had Willa's green eyes and what looked like it might be Pierce's dark hair, and he had a temperament that swung wildly between angelic contentment and furious demands for attention. The winter that followed was hard in some ways. Pierce could not leave Willa alone for long days anymore, not with a newborn and Margaret to care for, so he had to make his rounds shorter and more frequent. Money was tight with an extra mouth to feed and growing Margaret to clothe. But they managed, and more than that, they were happy. The cabin rang with baby cries and laughter, with Margaret's excited chatter about the books she was reading and Willa's singing as she nursed Will. Pierce would come home from checking fence lines or counting cattle to find his wife and son warm by the fire, Margaret helping with dinner preparations, and he would think about that day nearly a year ago when he had found Willa dying in the snow. If he had been riding a different section that day, If he had started out 10 minutes later, if any of 1,000 tiny things had been different, he never would have known her. They never would have had this life together. It terrified him sometimes, how close he had come to missing it all. Spring returned, and Will grew from a helpless infant into a roly-poly baby who smiled at everything and everyone. Margaret turned 14 and began attending the school in Pendleton, riding in twice a week with Pierce when he went to town for supplies. She was smart and eager to learn, making up for the years of education she had missed. Willa talked about becoming a teacher herself someday, once Will was older, and Pierce encouraged her dreams even though he privately wondered how they would manage. In summer, Pierce got a promotion. The Double Bar Ranch's foreman was impressed with how well Pierce had managed the Northern Line camp, and he offered Pierce a position as assistant foreman with a significant raise in salary. It meant more responsibility and longer hours sometimes, but it also meant stability and a future. They could start saving money, maybe even buy their own piece of land someday. That autumn, Willa told Pierce she was pregnant again. This time there was no nervousness, only joy and excitement. Will was nearly a year old, walking everywhere on unsteady legs and getting into everything he could reach. Margaret had blossomed into a bright, confident young woman who talked about going to teachers' college. The cabin that had seemed so small when Pierce and Willa first moved in now felt exactly the right size, full of life and love and possibility. The second baby, a daughter they named Charlotte after Pierce's mother, arrived in April of 1884 with far less drama than Will's birth. She was tiny and perfect with a cap of dark hair and lungs just as powerful as her brother's had been. Will was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to touch her constantly with his chubby toddler hands. Margaret appointed herself as assistant mother, helping with feedings and diaper changes and entertaining Will when Willa needed to rest. Pierce looked around his household and felt a contentment so deep, it was almost painful. 5 years ago he had been alone, drifting from job to job with no real purpose beyond survival. Now he had a wife he loved more with each passing day, 2 beautiful children, a sister-in-law he had come to think of as his own sister, and work that satisfied him. It was more than he had ever dared to dream of. Time continued its relentless march forward. The seasons cycled through their familiar patterns. Will grew tall and serious, helping his father with ranch work from the time he could sit a horse. Charlotte was bright and fearless, keeping up with her older brother and refusing to be left behind. Margaret graduated at the top of her class and did go to teachers' college, returning 2 years later to teach at the very school she had attended. She married a banker's clerk named Thomas Preston when she was 19. A good man who treated her with the kindness and respect she deserved. Pierce and Willa's marriage deepened and strengthened with each passing year. They had the normal struggles of any couple, disagreements about money or child rearing or whose turn it was to wake up with a sick child in the night. But they always worked through their problems with honesty and love, never going to bed angry, always remembering how precious it was that they had found each other at all. On their 10th anniversary, Pierce took Willa back to the line shack where he had first brought her all those years ago. It was maintained now by a different hand, but the foreman had given Pierce permission to use it for a night. They rode up together through spring wildflowers, leaving Will and Charlotte in Margaret's capable care, and when they stepped inside, Pierce was transported back to that desperate, terrified day when he had carried a dying woman through 6 miles of snow. "You ever regret it?" he asked Willa as they sat together on the same bunk where she had first opened her eyes and looked at him. "Do you ever wish your life had turned out differently?" Willa laced her fingers through his and kissed him softly. "Not for a single second." That was the worst day of my life and the best day all at once. It brought me to you." They made love as the sun set, with the tenderness and passion of long married lovers who knew every inch of each other and still found wonder in the discovery. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Pierce told Willa about the fear he had felt that day, the certainty that he would not make it to the shack in time, the overwhelming relief when she had survived. "I was so angry at your father," Pierce said. "Part of me still is, even though he is long dead. But another part of me is grateful because his cruelty led you to me." "Is that wrong?" "I do not think so," Willa said thoughtfully. "We cannot change the past, only accept it and move forward. My father was a broken man who did terrible things, but those things led to this, to us, to our children. I would go through it all again if I knew this was where I would end up." Years continued to pass in the way they do, marked by birthdays and holidays and small domestic triumphs. Will turned 16 and was hired on at the double bar as a junior hand, making his father proud with his skill and work ethic. Charlotte announced she wanted to be a doctor, a nearly impossible dream for a young woman in the 1890s, but Pierce and Willa encouraged her anyway, scraping together money for her education. Margaret and Thomas had 3 children of their own, expanding the family circle in wonderful ways. Pierce was promoted to foreman when the old foreman retired, and the ranch owner gave them a larger house closer to the main ranch buildings. It had 4 bedrooms and a real kitchen, and Willa cried when she first saw it. They filled it with the furniture they had collected over the years, added new pieces built by Pierce's own hands, and turned it into a home that was always open to family and friends. On a summer evening in 1895, when Pierce was 38 years old and Willa 33, they sat together on the porch of that house and watched the sun set over the Blue Mountains. Will was 20 now, courting a rancher's daughter from the next county. Charlotte was 17, preparing to leave for medical school back east, a miracle they still could not quite believe had happened. Margaret's children were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the warm breeze. "You remember the snow?" Willa asked, her head resting on Pierce's shoulder. "Every day," Pierce said. He did not have to ask what she meant. "I remember thinking I might not make it, that 6 miles was too far, but I could not leave you there. Something in me just knew that if I did not save you, I would regret it for the rest of my life." "You saved my life in so many ways," Willa said softly. "Not just pulling me from the snow, but everything after, giving me a home and a family and love. You showed me what life could be when someone treats you with kindness and respect." Pierce turned to look at his wife, seeing the girl he had found in the snow and the woman she had become all at once. There were strands of silver in her honey-colored hair now and lines at the corners of her eyes. But to him, she was as beautiful as she had been that first night in the line shack, when she had looked at him with such trust and hope. "I love you," he said, simple words that had never felt adequate to express the depth of what he felt. "Every single day I love you more." "And I love you," Willa replied, kissing him with the same sweetness as she had that first time. "Forever." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, their hands linked, their hearts beating in rhythm. Behind them was a lifetime of memories, ahead of them years yet to be lived. But in that moment, they were perfect content. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. The cowboy and the girl he had carried through the snow, bound together by fate and love, and the simple choice to care for someone in need. Their story had begun with an ending, with Willa's father throwing her out to die, but it had become something else entirely. A story of survival and hope, of family and devotion, of 2 hearts finding their home in each other. And they lived, truly and fully, happily ever after.